First United Methodist Church. This is the third in our series on James, which I've titled The Wisdom of Wholeness for our topic for the summer, the sort of cohesive governing idea behind all of the letter of James, in my opinion. So where we're at in our series, this is our third week. We've already talked about James chapter 1 in the first 2 weeks, where we hit some things like the main topics, why the letter is an enigma, and who the author likely is. We talked about the section on listening and doing and the structure last week. And this week we're going to talk about the topic of favoritism, which is what James 2, 1 through 13 talks about. But we're also going to talk about the Jewishness of James and why it's often called or considered the most Jewish of the writings in the New Testament, maybe alongside Matthew and Jude as the other kind of main examples. So last week, we talked about James 1 through 19 through 27, commending first listening. It says, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. But then it says that's not enough. You also have to do. And if you only listen, it's not enough. And so it likens somebody who listens to the word, to the Old Testament law, or the Old Testament in general, and hears it, but doesn't do anything about it, to being somebody who looked at their face in the mirror, but then didn't act on what they saw. And they, their knowledge was in the end useless. And that's what James is talking about here. So we need to listen and listen well. But once we listen and understand, we do need to act on that. Listening is not on its own enough. But we also talked about the structure of the book of James, and I talked about different theories because it is a somewhat confusing letter in terms of how it is structured. And I said that I think overall the best solution I've seen is the idea that there are these repeated themes of trials, wisdom, and then wealth and poverty. There's a twofold introduction. Then in chapter 1, that in verses 1 through 11, hits the topics of trials, then wisdom, then wealth and poverty, and then begins again a second round in chapter 1, starting at verse 12, going through the end in 27, hitting again trials, wisdom, and wealth and poverty one more time. And the main topics of the letter then are chapter 2 is talking about wealth and poverty, so it kind of goes in reverse order here from what we saw in the introduction. Then in chapter 3, halfway through chapter 4, we hit the topic of wisdom, including how you speak, and then we end with trials, and starting in halfway through chapter 4 and going through the end of the letter in chapter 5, with the exception of the last couple of verses of James, are then sort of a conclusion. So those would be what I think is the best structure for the book of James. Now, the topic we're going to bring up this time is the Jewishness of James, and why this is often thought to be the most Jewish writing in the New Testament. And I think a good entry into that discussion comes in James chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. When you read this, it seems mundane enough. It says, "My brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ, must not show favoritism. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes also comes in." There'd be nothing here to surprise us, particularly when we read it. But when you look at it in the Greek, an interesting thing happens. So when you look at it in the Greek, that word for meeting that I now have highlighted in yellow is actually the word synagogue. And that is the typical word used in the rest of the New Testament for a Jewish synagogue, the sort of place that Jesus may have debated teachers and Pharisees and others, where Jesus gives some of his sermons and everything is in a synagogue. And everywhere else in the New Testament, when we hear this word, it always means specifically the place Jews meet on Saturday to worship God and to hear sermons and to sing songs and to offer prayers. And so we ask, well, why is a Christian meeting being called a synagogue rather than a church? So this, I think, is a good way to start talking about the Jewishness of James, or it's a natural place to bring this up. Because, again, the addressees of James are the 12 tribes in the diaspora or the dispersion, those scattered among the nations. This is a technical word used at the time and today for those who live outside of Palestine, outside of the state of Israel, but are ethnically Jewish. That is the diaspora, the dispersion. So even today, a Jewish person living anywhere in America would be a diaspora Jew. Somebody living in Israel would be an Israeli Jew. But diaspora was a term for anyone living outside of Palestine, and that's who James is addressed to. And it doesn't seem metaphorical, as other parts of the New Testament might metaphorically speak of Christians as New Israel. This does not seem to say that at all. And then again, their meeting location here is the synagogue. There are a couple of possibilities for what this means. The word synagogue, as well as ecclesia, which we translate church, but means just assembly. They are words used just by general Greeks at the time for meetings and assemblies. There was nothing completely technical about them. So it could be that James is just using a word for meeting and doesn't mean it in the technical sense. That is possible. I think more likely, though, is that James thinks of the people he's writing to as attending synagogue and churches, and the two are kind of interchangeable for him precisely because he's writing to Christian Jews. And so what we're talking about then is a religious assembly that's meeting weekly, at this point presumably still on Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath. They're probably following all the Jewish food laws, kosher laws, as well as worship practices, celebrating things like Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, Passover, the Festival of Weeks, and so forth. They're probably celebrating in very Jewish ways, as we would see them. But they believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and they have now worked Jesus into their Jewish worship. But they don't yet have sort of separate Christian traditions. They don't have Christmas and Easter in the same sense as we do. Easter probably would, the celebration of Jesus' resurrection probably was part of Passover for them. So they would look Jewish to us, but they would have still believed that Jesus is the Messiah and Lord. That's what I think is probably happening here, though it's possible to read it in another way. And that second way is this. It's possible that it's a Jewish synagogue in the function that synagogues often played of community center, in which case this is a place frequented by both Christian and non-Christian Jews. And you would go there as sort of like a cultural center, as a place of learning, and a place to solve legal disputes, as well as your place that you go for worship on Saturdays. So this is how synagogues worked in the ancient world. It was far more than just a place to go on Saturdays. It was just the kind of Jewish cultural center in a city. And there was it was the place that they solved legal disputes within the community very often. Rather than go to the Roman authorities, you would often just go to your synagogue and have your local Jewish elders decide the case like arbiters would today for us. And so it's also possible that when James is talking about going into your meeting and you see these sorts of things, it's possible he's talking about a synagogue that would also be frequented by non-Christian Jews. And this is about not showing sort of favoritism within making legal decisions for the wider Jewish community. But either way, whatever meaning of synagogue or meeting we have here, it does likely indicate just how Jewish early Christianity was. And certainly the Christians following James here very much are thought of Jewish, worshiping in Jewish ways, or still being part of the wider Jewish community within a city, would be the implications here. Now, I think this kind of helps us to kind of step out for a second and just look at sort of how we envision Judaism and Christianity, and then we'll come back to James more specifically in a second here. But certainly what I would have taught or conceived of things as growing up, and I'm guessing this is true for many of us, we think of Jesus founding a new religion. I think a lot of encyclopedias, if you look Jesus up, it would say founder of Christianity. And in some sense that's true, but I think it's a little bit misunderstood at the same time. And then we usually think of Jesus' early followers as ethnically Jewish but religiously Christian. We think of them, when they followed Jesus, converting to Christianity. And we could still say, well, yes, the early followers were Jewish, but what we're meaning is they were ethnically Jewish. We don't really think of them usually still following Jewish ways. And yet that seems to be against the evidence. So most scholars today, both Jewish and Christian, usually follow the kind of pattern or the idea that I'm going to outline here. Usually scholars now think that Christians were seen by almost everyone, their fellow Jews. This is what the Christians themselves would have thought, and by Roman authorities, at least in the first century, the time that the New Testament is being written, as a sect of Jews, as a type of Jews. So we read in the New Testament, in the Gospels, of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians and the Zealots. We know from Josephus and Philo of some other groups, the Therapeutae, the Essenes, the trying to think, there are various other Jewish groups, the fifth philosophy or fourth philosophy, which were another type of Zealots. So we know of these sort of different Jewish sects, and by all accounts, it seems like early Christians, in their own understanding, in Jewish understanding, and in Roman understanding, would have just been another type of Jewish sect or party. And so when you see Jesus debating with the Pharisees, he's not debating Christian versus Jew. He's debating one type of Jew versus another type of Jew. And in fact, sometimes the Pharisees and Christians gather together and debate the Sadducees. There are occasional, not often, but there are occasional places where Pharisees and Christians actually become allies of each other's against Sadducees or Herodians or something like that. And usually it's thought by most scholars that the sort of division where we start thinking of Jew versus Christian rather than Christian as a type of Jew starts happening in the 2nd century. So it's not long after the end of the New Testament, but probably the entire New Testament is written at a time when Christians are a type of Jews. And things start slowly parting from the 2nd to the 4th century. And it would have happened little bit by little bit. There's no probably one-time break between Jews and Christians, and some people would have held an impression longer than others, and it might be also a little bit regional. But over the course of the 2nd to the 4th century, there are all these little partings that cumulatively, by the end of the 4th century, in almost everybody's mind, and starting as early as the 2nd century, Jews and Christians are now different groups, distinguishable. And for that reason, a lot of modern scholars are starting to speak of Christianity and Judaism as twin religions, rather than Christianity being born from Judaism. The idea is here, both of them are heirs of the ancient Israelite religion and emerge from that. But a lot of the distinctive things we think about of modern-day Jews, some of those are ancient and go back to the Old Testament, but other things that modern-day Jews practice are very much things that grew up in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or later centuries. And so there's a sense in which the modern form of Judaism grew up as a sibling at the same time that Christianity was growing up, and both of them had these formative times in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries AD. And it's also worth just saying that the ancient Jewish Christian community, meaning those who had an unbroken tradition, who had grown up following Jewish ways of worship, all the Jewish holidays, using kosher, being circumcised, all of those sorts of things continued on in an unbroken tradition all the way to the 7th century, to the Muslim conquest. So there was an unbroken tradition of some people combining Judaism and Christianity and thinking that was entirely natural for the entire Roman Empire until the Roman Empire fell, and even beyond that until the Muslim conquest in the 7th century. So there's a very long tradition of Jewish Christianity, the continued overlap of Judaism and Christianity, basically. So coming back to James then, why this is interesting is not only because James is addressed to the 12 tribes in the dispersion and talks about meeting in a synagogue, but also just from other literature, we know he is sort of the champion of Jewish Christianity, and in the same way that Paul becomes the champion of Gentile Christianity. Now, Paul is certainly a Jewish person, thinks of himself as Jewish, claims his Jewish heritage, so it's not like Paul isn't Jewish. But Paul usually speaks up for those who are non-Jewish in a lot of his ways. What we find of James is at the same side kind of saying, well, yes, that's true, but we also have to remember our Jewish brothers and sisters. And so James and Paul have different sort of emphases in terms of who they're looking out for. And we see this in a variety of different places. In our New Testament, we see it in the Jerusalem Council. In Acts 15 and Galatians 1, it records this event when Christians decide that somebody who is not Jewish, who is a Gentile, does not need to be circumcised to be part of the covenant community and to be saved. The reason when you read Acts 15 in particular, the last person to speak and who gives the final verdict is not, Peter, maybe we would expect, or one of the other disciples who was with Jesus. It's not Paul. it's James, it's this James who gives the final verdict. And the reason for that is probably because he was the person who is most likely to enforce circumcision, since he's thought of as the most Jewish of the early followers, the ones who does the most to retain kosher laws and all of that. It would have been surprising, or he was the most likely one person to think, no, to be a Christian you have to be a Jew even if you were ethnically Gentile, and he does not believe that. So he says Gentiles do not need to be circumcised to be saved, or to be Christians, but he does seem to think that if you're Jewish you should still keep following your Jewish ways. And then we see this just in a small little glimmer in Acts 21. Paul is returned to Jerusalem. Ultimately, there's going to be a riot, and Paul's going to be arrested, and all these sorts of things happen. But when Paul comes back, James rejoices at Paul's success among Gentiles, but he also then recalls Paul's mind to the Jews who are Christians in Jerusalem and says, but we also have to look out for them. And so he suggests that Paul shows, that he has goodwill towards his fellow Jews and goes to the temple and makes sacrifices, which Paul accepts and does. But we see James kind of looking out for Jewish Christians in Acts 21. And this just fits the pattern we know from, there are quite a few other ancient Christian writings. Some of these are like fictions and everything that are written maybe in the 4th century, so much later. But consistently in the later Christian writings, James is thought of as the hero or the champion of Jewish Christianity. And so we sense that he just has this legacy from how he lived his life. This is how he was remembered in later Christian history. So for all these reasons, this seemed like a good time to bring up the Jewishness of the letter and just kind of how Judaism and Christianity relate to each other, because I think it's a topic that's often misunderstood by most people in the modern world. So let's come then now, though, to the content of James chapter 2 and talk about favoritism. So we start off with this hypothetical situation where we have two people coming into the synagogue, a rich man and a poor man, and the rich man is displaying his wealth, and the poor man, unfortunately, can't but display his poverty as he comes in. And we mentioned earlier that the synagogue could be thought of in two ways, either as a worship service or as a law court. If it is this religious worship service, then what people are doing when they see the rich person walk in, and the reason he's being given favoritism is probably they're seeking a patron, somebody to help pay the bills and support the community and everything. I think it's not something we should by any means aim for. I think it's bad, but I think it's natural, even in churches today. If somebody with wealth walks into your church service, part of your thinking is, I hope they join because that tithe check is going to be great, right? And we could really use the money. We shouldn't, in fact, that's the whole point of James 2, treat someone differently depending on their wealth or poverty, but it is natural impulse because organizations need money to run, and so it's very likely that would be the reason here that the community is favoring the rich person, is because they're looking for a patron. If, on the other hand, as we talked about, a synagogue can also be a law court, if that's the sense, then it's the idea that rich people in the courts typically get their way. They have more access to power and just have more power in general, and so they might that James is warning against your justice being swayed by wealth. Then in verses 5 through 7, James kind of flips the table on what we expect from the world and says, in fact, the poor are more often godly people. He says that the rich are exploiting you and are blaspheming the name of him to whom you belong, meaning Jesus, whereas God was pleased to give the kingdom he promised to those who are poor, and so forth. There's this idea that the poor are more often godly. This might be a local situation that in this particular community or at this particular time, rich people tended to be more exploitative and poor people tended to be better. But again, there isn't like a specific audience. James is writing to the whole kind of world, all Jews living outside of Palestine. So it seems more likely that what James is saying here is that the church should make a point of defaulting to siding with the poor over the rich. There are exceptions. There are godly rich people by all means, of course, and there are ungodly poor people by all means, of course. So it's not saying that this is like always, but I think what James is probably doing is pushing back against the world, because in the world, rich people usually get their way in most situations. You have power, you have wealth, you can kind of display yourself in these sorts of ways. And so generally within sort of how the world thinks, we usually default to giving the rich power and the rich the say in things. And James wants to counteract that by saying in the church, we should actually do the opposite, because we're naturally inclined to favor the rich. And so we actually have to kind of make a considered effort to naturally side with the poor so that we kind of counteract that tendency. And there is some indication, especially in the ancient world, that for the most part, the people who did respond to the Christian message were people who were poor. And so at the time, it very much does seem to have been the case that the poor were far more likely to be Christian than the rich. So James makes that point in the middle paragraph. And then at the end, he talks about the reason we keep the law. And he says it's because we want to honor the lawgiver. And I'd say there's 2 points that are being made in verses 8 through 13. The first is you can't pick and choose your commandments. So breaking favoritism is still breaking the law because we're told not to do it in the law. And then he gives an example of breaking one of the 10 commandments, but not another. He says you're still breaking the 10 commandments, whether you can't just say, oh, I've kept 9 of the 10. I'm really great. You're still a lawbreaker if you break one of the 10 commandments. So he does at the end talk about mercy. So this is not to say you have to have perfection and can never make a mistake. He does talk about mercy at the end of this section in verses 12 and 13. But I think the more kind of interesting thing about what he does here is that the reason he gives for this is not like, how dare you, you're supposed to follow the law, and kind of keeps it at an abstract level. But he says in verse 11, how he phrases it, for he who said, meaning God said, you shall not commit adultery, also said, you shall not commit murder. So he recalls us back to the fact that to obey the law is to honor God. And we don't just obey the law because abstractly we're supposed to obey the law, but instead because God gave it, and we want to honor the God who gave the law. And so there's this much more personal reason for why we should obey the law that James gives in this section as well. So some takeaways for me from the topics that we've talked about. First of all, on the kind of conceptual topic, Christianity is Jewish, and we need to respect Jewish people. So it's Jewish, and we should think about it as Jewish. A lot of our traditions, including baptism, were done by Jews before Christianity was ever a thing. Baptism precedes Christianity, and most of our festivals and religious worship comes out of the synagogue, and even things like Easter and Good Friday and everything. In many ways, what we're doing is we're kind of changing or refracting what Jewish people do with Passover. And so, a lot of ways Christians are sort of in a new form, still observing Jewish ways. And so just to remember the very deep Jewish heritage that Christianity has, but also need to respect modern Jews, and remember that they are the people of God, and that God loves them as the people. And I would say one of the ways that I see Christians violating this without even thinking about this is kind of bashing all ancient Jews of the time of the New Testament as legalists or horrible people or something like that. And it's we often speak very unkindly of Jews in the first century. And yes, some Jews opposed Christianity and some Jews killed Jesus, but that doesn't mean all Jews did, because the Christians were Jews, and all the writers in the New Testament were Jews at the same time. So just being careful in how we speak about Jews in the New Testament times is one of the ways I think that's important. I would say, and I'll see if this provokes discussion on Sunday morning, but I would say that we should, as Christians, default to siding with the poor, precisely to counteract the world's default of siding with the rich. Again, there are tons of exceptions. So there are some very godly rich people, and there are some ungodly poor people. But I think the church needs to make a point, because the natural tendency is to do the opposite. If we're ever faced with a situation of a dispute between poor and rich, or two different people walk into our congregation, one's clearly rich, one's clearly poor, is to force ourselves to try to first go to the poor person and to try to side with the poor person kind of as the initial impulse, precisely because everything in our world and in our nature, I think, usually pulls us in the opposite direction. And so a way to, in a sense, aim at equality is actually by making a concerted effort to side with the poor. And I think that's what James is teaching here. But again, maybe you will disagree, so I'll see if this provokes any lively discussion on Sunday. A couple questions to think about. What did you already know about Christianity and Judaism? What did you learn from what I just presented? And what is the importance of this? And how would our church receive those two people in in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4? That's something that we'll probably spend some time thinking about on Sunday together. So that's what is for this coming Sunday. For the following Sunday at the end of June, the passage we'll read is James 2:14 through 26. And the questions I'll want you to consider is, if you have the time and want to do this, go to Romans 3:21 and read the rest of Romans 3 and then all of Romans 4, and then come back and read that passage in James and ask yourself, is James contradicting Paul? And explain your thoughts on that. So we'll talk about why these sound different, at least, and what that means for us. And the second thing we'll just talk about is, what is the importance of works if Christians are saved by grace? We're saved by faith, or we're saved by grace. So what would be the importance of works if we are saved by faith or grace? So those are the things we'll talk about for the following week. But this current Sunday is on the first half of James 2 instead.